Jason Lustig. I'm a lecturer and the Israel Institute teaching fellow here at UT's Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this really exciting event that we have Liora Halperin joining us all the way from Seattle. She's going to be speaking about her book. I'm going to say just a word about it in just a moment. But first, I just want to thank all of you for being here. Today we have about an hour or so for our program in total, and Liora is going to have a really interesting presentation and also a chance for us to talk about her research and her book. So to say a quick word about Liora and about what she'll be discussing, Liora R. Halperin is an associate professor of International Studies, History, and Jewish Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle, where she also holds the Jack and Rebecca Benaroya Endowed Chair in Israel Studies in the Jackson School of International Studies. Liora recently published a really phenomenal new book titled The Oldest Guard, Forging the Zionist Settler Past, which just came out a few months ago now from Stanford University Press. And the book is a history of local memory and the politics of commemoration surrounding the early Jewish agricultural colonies, which were established in Ottoman Palestine towards the end of the 19th century. What has been known in Zionist historiography, in the Zionist narrative of talking about their history as the so-called first Aliyah. And so this is a really exciting book. Overall, I actually just got a copy of it from the press recently, and I've really enjoyed sort of going through it, and I'm really happy that Liora is able to join us to talk about it and the big issues that are kind of surrounding the early Zionist movement and its context in Ottoman Palestine. And then I should also mention that Liora is the author of another excellent book which came out a few years back titled Babel in Zion: Jews, Nationalism, and Language Diversity in Palestine, 1920 to 1948, which very much looks at the landscape of languages in the land of Israel. And sort of, I think we can see both of these books as really landmark sort of developments in terms of our understanding of the complexity of Jewish settlements in Palestine in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I'm really thrilled that Liora is able to join us. We had initially talked about having her in person. Unfortunately, COVID intervened, but at least we're able to do it in this way. So Liora, thank you so much for being here. And we're really excited to hear about your book and about your broader research on these issues. Oh, you're muted.
Yes, I am muted, and now I'm not muted anymore. Well, thank you everyone for welcoming me. I will share my screen and hope that this works. Yeah, that looks okay. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. I used to fly into Austin when I went to visit my grandparents who lived in Temple for a good while. So I have fond childhood memories of being there, and I'm sorry I couldn't make it. So I want in my talk today to kind of give you both an introduction to the topic and also a little kind of a taste for the kinds of arguments that I make and the kinds of sources that I use to make those arguments. So I want to start with one of my most fun sources, which is a bottle of brandy. So this is a bottle of brandy that was produced in 1960 by the Friedman and Sons Winery in Petah Tikva, which is an Israeli city located about 10 kilometers east of Tel Aviv. It was produced to celebrate the 90th birthday of the man whose face you see on the front and the back, Avraham Shapira. Avraham Shapira was an early colonist and longtime head guardsman in what had begun as a Jewish agricultural colony in Ottoman Palestine in 1878. Petah Tikva's founders were Jewish religious modernists from Jerusalem, but they soon abandoned the colony due to agricultural failure And then it was revived in 1883 by a small group of immigrants from the Russian Empire. And it was around this time, around 1883, that Shapira came there. Petah Tikva would grow into one of the largest private colonies in the Jewish community of Palestine and then Israel, and also became the center of Palestine's Jewish citrus export industry. So let's look a little more closely at this bottle. This bottle, as you can see, has an English language label. It was produced in part for export. And that label suggested to consumers that a drink would take you back to the early years of the mother colony and the foremost of its defenders, Abraham Shapira, who devoted himself to the defense of its fields and vineyard. We now supply it to persons of discerning taste for their exquisite enjoyment. Consumers partaking of these spirits could simultaneously imbibe a past framed as a site of frontier heroism and successful agriculture, signal their middle-class consumer aesthetics, and understand their luxury consumption as a nationalist act. By the time this brandy bottle got made in 1960, Petah Tikva was no longer a tiny agricultural colony. It had become a city of nearly 60,000 residents, most of whom were immigrants from post-Holocaust Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. Most of these immigrants, as well as immigrant generations before them, would have become acquainted with Shapira through a variety of familiar, stylized public performances. So you can see the pipe, the sword, the man on horseback, the riding boots, all of these things recurred in commemorations. As the former head guardsman of Petah Tikva, Shapira came to be known, at least as far back as the 1930s, as the oldest of the guards, Zekan HaShomrim in Hebrew. So this is the origin of my book's title for anyone who's wondering. And in fact, the cover of the book, which you see there, shows Shapira on horseback in a 1929 parade in Netanya. Shapira remained not only a sought-after symbol of early Petah Tikva and late 19th century agricultural colonization, but also more generally as an exemplar of a legacy of Zionism as a settlement movement that city leaders wanted immigrants to see themselves as participants in. So the book, The Oldest Guard, is a study of local memory processes and the political stakes of memory, not during the period in the 19th century associated with this colonization, but rather in the mid-20th century, between the 1920s and the 1960s, over periods of Ottoman and then British and then Israeli state rule. Michel Rolfe-Trouillot has famously emphasized in his classic work, Silencing the Past, that we must not think of the past as something that simply happened, but rather something created. He says that those commemorating the past do not succeed such a past, they are its contemporaries, right? That past lives and is co-created alongside them. And that means when an image of Shapira was evoked between World War I and the 1960s, what was being evoked was not only the 1880s or 1890s, but also the decades-long 20th century history of local memory itself. So they were remembering the process of remembering that past. So here's a contemporary Google map. You can see Petah Tikva, you can see Tel Aviv and Jaffa. In the next few moments, I'm going to take you through a series of 3 further maps that I hope will help orient you and also introduce some of the stakes and contours of my arguments. And then we'll get more into some of my specific source material and even try to bring the story a bit towards the present. All right, so map number 1 is a map of the Jewish agricultural colonies that are associated with what's known as the first Aliyah, or first wave of rural Jewish agricultural settlement in Palestine. The founders of these colonies, known in Hebrew as moshavot, although originally known as coloniot, the word colony, were founded by individuals compelled by Enlightenment rhetoric, Haskalah rhetoric, that emphasized the importance of agriculture for Jewish productivization, But they were also inspired by traditional Jewish affinity to the land of Israel, and also, in the case of immigrants, by spikes of anti-Semitic violence, especially in the Russian Empire. The term moshavot is a literal translation of the word colonies. And these are the colonies that became, right, the first wave in a multi-stage narrative of rural Jewish settlement. But here's where things get really quite tricky. The fact is that the earliest of these colonies, in fact, predated the establishment of the Zionist movement by Theodor Herzl in 1897. And moreover, despite being ascribed firstness after World War I, the first Aliyah colonies long had an ambivalent relationship to the Zionist movement, and also the Zionist movement to them. These colonies remained in private hands. They were privately owned lands, even as Herzl's Zionist organization began to endorse and coordinate models of organized collective national land purchase in the name of the Jewish people. And moreover, the first Aliyah colonists often remained religiously traditional. They were unorganized politically, and they hired Palestinian native labor to do agricultural work instead of only Jews. And all of these features rendered them suspect following World War I in the eyes of a set of movements generally known as labor Zionism. Labor Zionists were left-wing nationalists inspired by socialism. They championed the labor collective known as the kibbutz, which some of you may know of or know well, which became really the icon of early Zionist settlement. Labor Zionists promoted Jewish-only labor, they called it Hebrew labor, in the interest of absorbing as many Jewish immigrants as possible. And in fact, it was labor Zionists who began to arrive in the decade before World War I, who actually coined the term first Aliyah and called themselves the second Aliyah, out of an effort to distinguish themselves from their, in their view, disgraced predecessors. So I want to share with you a satirical anecdote from the 1940s, from a genre known as the chizbat, a kind of humorous anecdote. In this anecdote, an ideological Jewish worker, a labor Zionist, addresses a veteran Jewish farmer, a private colonist, in Hebrew, the emerging national language. The farmer, not understanding, turns to his Arab worker and asks him in Yiddish, Muhammad, vos zog der? Muhammad, what is he saying? This joke neatly encapsulates the stereotypical first Aliyah type in the minds of labor Zionist elites. The farmer has Arab workers. He's a speaker of Yiddish, the principal symbol of the European diaspora, Jewish diaspora. And of course, ironically, the Arab worker understands Hebrew better than the Jewish farmer. This first Aliyah, second Aliyah conflict over labor practices and ideological activism brings me to my second map. This is a detailed map of Jewish land holdings in Palestine by 1944, which was approaching the end of the British Mandate period. The first Aliyah colonies are shown with black circles on this map, so you can see their general location. All of them are on land marked as green, privately owned land. But you can also see that despite the rhetorical prominence of labor Zionist settlements on Jewish National Fund or nationally owned lands, 3/4 of Palestine's Jewish population actually lived in the green areas, these private lands. These lands produced oranges, Palestine's largest export crop. This region had also become the core of the Arab export economy in the mid-19th century. It's also, of course, the location of Tel Aviv, the city founded in 1909 that became really the capitalist center and hub of Israel. And yet, as my colleague Nahum Karlinsky puts it, the socialist valley, with its preponderance of Jewish National Fund lands, has displaced the capitalist plain, and by extension, the largest private colonies in collective memory. And so one piece of this project was recovering the stories of this area that evolved into the capitalist plain. Come the 1910s and 1920s, the elites in these colonies often understood themselves to be pragmatic and moderate, as opposed to the hot-headed ideologues of the labor Zionist movement. All of these actors were engaging in what I call in the book, the politics of apoliticism, the practice of marking some realms of activity, specifically economic activity or investment, as non-political or non-ideological, while marking any opposition to those practices as political. And I'll return to that point. But this map that I've just shown you, map 2, was limited in that it shows Arab Palestinian spaces in white, and that was also the case on map 1. So we might ask, where is Muhammad, this fictional Arab worker who comprehended Hebrew and Yiddish? The reality is that he was right there, not somewhere off stage, but in the colony itself. The Australian historian Penelope Edmonds argues in her work on 19th century Melbourne that the frontier is not an outward moving linear abstraction. It's not the line between white and color on Zionist maps. Rather, she writes, the frontier was often domestic, local, and personal. And this was particularly true of first Aliyah moshavot, or colonies, for a similar reason. They hired Arab laborers, much to the chagrin of their critics. And through these contacts, which in reality were often exploitative and could be abusive, they began to construct memories of a certain kind of coexistence, what I call hierarchical coexistence. So this is what brings us to the third map. It's a map not only of the first Aliyah colonies, but of the many nearby villages that supplied their labor, resisted land sales, including through violence, and sometimes entered into limited personal relationships with colonists. In 1948, up to 750,000 Palestinian Arabs, and almost all of them living in this central coastal region of the country, were displaced from the landscape in the midst of the 1948 Israeli War of Independence. And the vast majority were not allowed to return after. But all of the villages circled in red are mentioned in local commemorative materials around the first Aliyah. They're part of the memory of these Jewish spaces, even after many of these villages ceased to exist. And so the story of memory that I try to tell is a story of map layers. It's not just a story of colonies in the late 19th century. It's a story of communities that developed their local memory amidst older Palestinian cities, later Zionist communities, and Palestinian villages, present and then absent. So who is doing this remembering? Workers' parties during the British Mandate period after World War I suggested that only they cared about the settlement past and the settlement future. The private farmers and their sons and grandsons, and sometimes daughters, thought differently. They resemble a group that Alan Gordon, in his work on commemoration activities in Montreal in the early 20th century, calls heritage elites. So it's a term I borrow. These were middle-class residents who established societies for the preservation of the city's settler heritage and controlled the city's vision of itself. The heritage elites, in my context, were not especially popular among the growing Jewish working class, but they held local power, commanded resources, and scripted memories that percolated far beyond their own limited circles. Moreover, given their religious inclinations, critique of labor Zionism, and commitment to private ownership, they also drew support from religious Jews in Palestine, elsewhere, including urban Jews, right-wing revisionists, and Sephardi Zionists who had been long resident in Palestine since before Zionism. All of these groups in different ways were suspicious of the emerging labor Zionist apparatus, but shared a sense of commitment to the broader settlement and Jewish modernization project. So how did these heritage elites construct a local memory that they could then disseminate? They planned commemorations, they gathered documents, they took oral histories, they planned events and built exhibitions, and sometimes they hosted groups of visiting school children, some of whom would send back their letters and drawings. And this image here is a school child's drawing sent to a old man who migrated to Palestine in 1882. And there's an amazing archival file full of these that I was thrilled to discover. So these creations became some of my sources, and so did the small local settlement archives that often preserved them. These are places often located on streets named for settlers or early settlement activities, where things are organized haphazardly. So here is a listing for the brandy bottle that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, and you can see that its location, which I translated, is on the shelf in Galia's office. So this is not good archival practice. Jason can tell you about that. So it means that I was reading about local efforts to produce a compelling, smooth narrative of the past in places that were often haphazard, and also the places that were actually, committed to telling a very particular narrative. And yet I was sitting there in these very spaces looking for wrinkles and gaps and trying to understand the construction and omissions inherent within them. So I want now to turn to a few of the many episodes I consider in the book, settings where memory was made or articulated or deployed. And I'm going to focus on those that exemplify the two themes that I already mentioned. The politics of apoliticism, that is the tendency of these owners of capital to think of themselves as moderate and distance themselves from the political, while still engaging quite outwardly in expressions of nationalism. And second, the rhetoric of hierarchical coexistence, which was enabled by real historical practices of their hiring Arab unskilled labor. So let me start with several examples of the first, this politics of apoliticism. So part of the reason the first Aliyah colonies have been neglected is that they were politically organized or even apathetic. Orit Rosin, a Tel Aviv historian, says that their intellectual horizons extended no farther than their farms and towns. But these very farms and towns became the spaces through which they promoted a particular vision of economic development beyond politics, not only to fellow Zionists, but also to interested imperial and international observers. Okay, so you can see here Arthur James Balfour, who visited Petah Tikva in 1925. Balfour had issued the famous wartime Balfour Declaration, expressing British support for a Jewish national home. He came in 1925, once the British mandate was in place. He took tours of citrus groves and heard from owners of land who presented themselves as the main communities investing in Palestine. This is what the British wanted to hear. The British had been tasked by the League of Nations with developing Palestine economically, and they wanted to do so with as little burden to the British taxpayer as possible, right? So economic investment taken on by these settlers themselves seemed to be not only a contribution to Jewish nationalism, but to the British, it was a contribution to civilization more generally. In fact, the Secretary of State for the Colonies in 1923 commented that by giving Jews the opportunity to develop Palestine, we are serving the interests of civilization as a whole, quite apart from any sentimental considerations about restoring a scattered people to its ancient fatherland. Okay, so you can see here you have one narrative that comes from one place, and then you have an imperial narrative that comes from a different place. These private colonies were very good at speaking to that specific interest. A few years later, in 1931, the British High Commissioner for Palestine, John Chancellor, visited another large export colony, Rishon LeZion, known for its grapes and wine production. This was reported on by the Arabic press, in addition to the Hebrew press, and he made a striking assertion. Work alone, not politics, is what illuminates the path of life. This speech was cited, as I said, by urban Arab landowners, often the competitors of the Jewish colonists, who also would have been well attuned to these dynamics of proving economic vitality to the British. Chancellor's assessment both reflected and motivated an ethos of Jewish private farming that differentiated work, which they associated with themselves, from politics, which they associated with both labor Zionists and Arabs who wanted to resist Zionist settlement. One farmer wrote in 1908 in a newspaper that, he and his landowning friends were not against Jewish workers. They were just against workers who were not good workers and not serious workers. He writes, if you are talking about real workers who get up in the morning and go home at night, then there are no conflicts between Jewish workers and farmers. But if you're talking about eaters of vanilla ice cream fighting the war of the workers, if there's a division between that group and the people of the Jewish community, what's the big shock? So you can see here that he's promoting an idea of the docile Jewish worker, right? Speaking about not wanting class conflict, right? These are familiar themes we hear from owners of capital in any environment. But the fact was that while promoting the idea of a docile Jewish worker, these employers made use of Arab workers for most of their unskilled labor needs. And this is what brings me to my second set of sources, which is about the rhetoric of hierarchical coexistence. When the American Yiddish writer Yehoash, a pseudonym or pen name for Solomon Blumgarten, visited Palestine in 1914, he noted that most Jewish colonists know only enough Arabic to converse with their Arab wagon driver or Arab help. So they weren't totally fluent. And nonetheless, the specific ability to converse with a hired employee was precisely what distinguished these private farmers from their Hebrew labor supporting counterparts, who didn't have Arab wagon drivers to begin with. And those Ashkenazi Jewish colonists who achieved spoken proficiency in Arabic became particularly important symbols of hierarchical coexistence. One of them was Avraham Shapira. In testifying to the Shaw Commission, convened in 1929 to investigate the countrywide riots of 1929, he stressed that he had had no problem with his Arab workers and in fact refused to agree to a workman being replaced by another. That is, he had kind of a pragmatic economic argument that wasn't going to be bothered by this ideological nonsense. And he stressed that this arrangement could occur because the colony was not under Zionist organizational control. In other words, right, it was an independent operation where everyone, he says, is his own landlord. So in local settler collective memory in these particular communities, sites of menial labor were actually refigured as sites of coexistence and even friendship. Some accounts from Arab workers were particularly important in sustaining this image. One of them, as it happens, comes from an Arab wagon driver, a man named Abu Farid, who worked for the Aronson family in Zichron Yaakov. Abu Farid was being interviewed by a man named Herzl Chayutman, whose father founded yet another private colony. So Abu Farid remembered in his interview that his former employer used to speak as though the two were equal. He'd say, listen, Abu Farid, if I made pita, we'd have to split it equally. If we sat down to eat, you aren't my servant, we are equal. Even if you wait for me at the entrance to the inn, holding the reins of the two horses and help me get on the horse once we get to Jerusalem, here while we are on the road, we are brothers, and so we will be always. Aronson is promoting a specific kind of coexistence. Right? The Arab is employed by the Jewish farmer and depends on him for his livelihood, but nonetheless, the Jewish narrator characterizes them as equals, natives in an intimate and mutually respectful relationship. Okay, Abu Farid was almost certainly grateful for the employment, but we're reading him through the translation and lens of the man interviewing him, for whom this kind of hierarchical yet amicable relationship is part of the stock narrative of the agricultural colonies. There's a kind of willful fantasy going on here, and it's one that scholars of other situations of labor arrangements have observed. So historian Pramila Nadison, who's a US historian, has observed similar perceptions among white housewives with Black domestic workers, whom she noted they considered part of the family. These housewives claim to feel an emotional bond, mutual obligations, and a relationship separate from the marketplace. But Nadison observes that the rhetoric of friendship and family obscured what was in fact a market relationship. And this sort of disjuncture between the rhetoric or experience of friendship and coexistence and the structures of economic hierarchy is central to what I'm calling a discourse of hierarchical coexistence. And this is not unique to this particular setting. So let's continue to explore this theme of hierarchical coexistence after 1948. Part of my book deals with the period under the British, before 48, but my last two chapters deal with the post-1948 period. As I mentioned, in 1948, Zionist militias and then Israeli military forces radically altered this landscape of contact, displacing almost all of the residents of those coastal villages in the context of a civil war and then a regional war. The state then began to settle new, largely poor Jewish immigrants on those lands. And that's something I talk about in parts of the book, and I'm not talking about a lot today, but maybe someone will ask a question about it. However, 150,000 Palestinian Arabs remained in Israel, many of them internally displaced. And in 1952, if they were physically in residence, they were granted citizenship, but subject to a military government. So as Israel structured its relationship to its Palestinian citizen minority, Arab Israelis in the Israeli language or parlance, a figure like Shapira could be elevated as an exemplar of hierarchical coexistence. And this happened in a variety of ways, and I'm going to point to one. On November 20th, 1957, more than 400 Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel gathered in Kfar Qasim, which was one of just a few Arab villages in this central part of the country that had survived the war in a region known as the Triangle. The previous year, Israeli border police had committed the massacre of 48 Palestinian citizens of Israel after the group unknowingly disobeyed a military government curfew. So after initially trying to cover up the massacre, the government arranged a solha, a long-standing type of reconciliation ceremony typical in rural Palestine. And they chose Avraham Shapira to preside. So in choosing a solha, Israel claimed to be resolving the affair on Arabs' own terms. The historian Shira Robinson suggests that this kind of framework reproduced an image of Palestinians as tribesmen who either rejected or did not understand modern judicial procedures. But I claim that it didn't just do that. It also promoted an essentialized image of early Zionists, and specifically first Aliyah settlers. This was a state-orchestrated event in response to a state-perpetrated massacre. But Shapira represented a rural frontier population that lived near and employed Arabs and had the personal relationships to resolve conflicts outside the judicial mechanisms of the state. The literary scholar and Indigenous Studies professor Mark Rifkin has argued that the frontier is not a geographic space, but a structure of feeling that offers a way of envisioning a place paradoxically within the state yet beyond it. Israel entered this conceptual space by employing a custom that evoked settlers and pre-state practice. Israel was also making a point about labor relations. Petah Tikva mayor Pinchas Rashish spoke at the event and noted that many residents of Kfar Qasim make a living from working in Petah Tikva. So I saw it as my obligation to intervene for their benefit. Hierarchical labor relations, now between Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens, produced the proximity and familiarity that Rashish claimed had compelled and enabled coexistence. So this is a later iteration of a dynamic that we saw emerging rhetorically before 1948. And yet, villages could be both remembered and forgotten. Just 4 years after the Kfar Qasim Solha ceremony, the Petah Tikva municipality honored Shapira by planting a Jewish National Fund forest in his honor. And they built it on the remnants of Kula, which was a village also near Tel Aviv that had been captured, depopulated, and then destroyed. And so the rhetoric of hierarchical coexistence did not just express nostalgia for real contact. It could also compensate for and obscure the new absence of that kind of contact. So I've given you just kind of a set of examples here that illustrate some of the themes that I've pointed to in the book and that were of interest to me in my research. So I want to conclude by talking about two broader areas of discussion. One of them pertains to thinking about Jewish and Zionist settlement in a comparative context, and the other traces some of these lineages closer to the present day after 1967, right, which is the context in which we now tend to refer to something called the settler movement in Israel. So you probably noticed that in my talk, I've quoted from a bunch of scholars who work on the US or Canada or Australia. These are scholars of what academics now call settler colonialism. These are instances involving settlers who understand themselves as modern people coming to build a model society for themselves in a non-modern place, a place that needs to be developed. And this has become a real hot button topic, as many of you surely know. Zionist memory is, of course, a unique variant of ethno-national or nationalist memory. It emerges from a movement for self-determination. It's connected to an ancient history in the land. All of these things are absolutely true. But the Zionist movement was unique among nationalist movements in the 19th and 20th century in using land settlement as the main mechanism for national revival. The emphasis on modern settlers and settlement that I found in my archival material is not especially amenable to comparisons with small Eastern European or Central European nationalisms, comparisons that are certainly useful in other contexts. And so I found myself turning to scholars who truly were focused on settlement and memories of settlement. These were scholars who understood the near obsessive settler focus on chronicling modern firsts. They understood the concern about a hostile landscape and hostile people. They understood how settlers disagree with each other about who was first, while also participating in making whatever preceded the first invisible, whether that's Palestinian Arabs, the majority of the population, or urban Jewish communities, including the Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews who brokered land sales, served as guardsmen, or did menial labor in the colonies alongside Arabs. So is the field of settler colonialism applicable to Zionism? I think it's not really a yes/no answer. Some concepts and ideas from this field are less applicable, but some very clearly are, and you saw me trying to apply them. But I want to also note that this isn't just a story of contemporary scholars making comparison. Historical actors also saw these parallels. American Zionists in the mid-20th century thought of the agricultural pioneers as the Jewish cowboys. Conversely, in 1940, a group convening to draw attention to pre-Zionist Jewish settlement in Palestine explicitly compared their work to the old settler associations in the United States, elevating the fathers of the settlement project in America. And in fact, I'm continuing to do work on these, this sort of broader commemorative context, which I can talk about as well. One might protest, well, what about all the differences? And of course, there are a lot of differences between the Zionist case and the mostly earlier Anglo-American cases. And yet, as the University of Chicago historian Tara Zara has recently shown, as Central and Eastern European countries faced mass immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, statements in support of purposeful immigrant colonization proliferated. Rather than simply leave, settler colonists could help develop regions within other empires, British Empire, French Empire, which in turn could facilitate approval of those initiatives. So the workings of settler memory in the Zionist case don't exist in opposition from its nationalist memory discourse. They complement each other in an era where settlement seemed to be a logical way to achieve national objectives. Both national rebirth and settlement remain important facets of the Zionist project and of Israeli collective memory. And here I want to transition to kind of my final set of points about the post-1967 context. Israel's land conquests in the 1967 Six-Day War caused the dormant codes of the immigrant settler political culture to be reawakened. And that's a quote from the sociologist Baruch Kimmerling. And as Israel and its settlers established communities on the premise that facts on the ground would ensure Jewish security and primacy, Those commemorating earlier settlement connected their contemporary settlement with that historical settlement. Commemorations of the first Aliyah, including the 100th anniversary celebration in February 1982, noted the explicit connections. So you can see some quotes here kind of expressing a desire or a counterfactual wish that if only settlement back then had been more extensive, how much better of a position would we be in today? These memories of settlement and the advance of civilization were not focused on ideas of political organizing. They didn't dwell on experiences of European anti-Semitism, all of which are things that would be very important in other Zionist memory contexts. In these settings, the face of Zionism was the face of a heroic settlement project. The establishment of new or expanded Jewish communities was a centrally important way to achieve or to maintain national goals. The 2018 nation state law, passed as a basic law in Israel, includes the wording that the state views the development of Jewish settlement as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation. This is not only official policy, but a basic law with a kind of quasi-constitutional standing. It's about a move from temporary to permanent settlement, from desert to civilization, and ultimately from danger to safety. All of these in different ways are concerns shared by other settler societies. As I completed my book, I had on my mind the first Aliyah past, of course. And yet I couldn't help but find resonances in the present. One of the most important comparison points that I came to was that Jewish employers still hire Palestinian workers, and they still talk about coexistence with those workers. Much of the Israeli electorate considers itself non-ideological, right? And they speak of their settlement or simply their existence as something that's not intended to be up here in the ideological clouds, but simply kind of a pragmatic and moderate existence. Even as Israelis across the political spectrum evoke the frontier hero on a barren landscape, they've also shared with contemporary anthropologists their more quotidian experiences of interethnic conflict in a fundamentally shared space. In fact, many on the Israeli center and right today reject what they see as a left-wing Zionist bid for Jewish-Arab separation that dates back to early labor Zionism and its policies of labor separation. The left is always talking about coexistence, said a Jewish settler in Efrat in the West Bank, but they don't mean coexistence, they mean separation. The right, we are living in coexistence. Anthropologist Jeremy Siegman interviewed supermarket shoppers in Ma'ale Adumim near Jerusalem, often considered a non-ideological settlement. He observed that settler consumers often enjoyed the everyday, albeit limited, experience of interacting with Palestinian employees. They offered up smiling, wistful references to individuals who had worked for them, often mixed in with broader anti-Palestinian sentiments. When asked by Israeli or Western news outlets, Palestinian workers attest to being thankful for their jobs. When settlers in Efrat, near Bethlehem, invited Palestinian workers and leaders for a Sukkot meal, which is what you're seeing in this image, they said to reporters, they treat us very well and we are very good to them too. And yet, as anthropologist Ethan Morton Jerome has noted, working class Palestinians, like working class individuals in a variety of cultures, are forced to work for the very economic system that exploits them. But in this case, it's a system that doesn't provide them citizenship rights or labor rights. But because they involve market mechanisms, these types of relationships are sometimes framed as non-political or beyond politics. So in this sense, they're repeating or expanding on discourses that we already observe in First Aliyah or colony commemorations. So I want to just conclude here by saying that claims of employers or owners of capital to get along well with workers are not especially new. They're not unique to Israel. nor is the sentiment that such workers are also potentially hostile. So what do we see then when we tell a story of Zionism and settlement beyond labor Zionism, beyond the lingering icon of the kibbutz? What story of linkages between settlement and private enterprise over its many phases is still missing from our understanding of Israeli history? My research has made me acutely aware of what still remains hidden in plain sight in the story of Israel-Palestine, both its Jewish history and its Palestinian history. And I hope that you'll also take some inspiration from this talk about work that remains to be done. So with that, I'm going to pause and hopefully answer some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liora. That was really fantastic, really interesting. We do have some time for questions. Normally I would get us started, but we don't have a huge amount of time, so I want to give people in the audience a chance to perhaps ask the first question. Anybody has any questions to get us started with Dr. Halperin? I mean, I could get us started. Why don't I do that? Like I was saying, this is just a phenomenal research project, and I think really poses a lot of really important questions about thinking about the history of Jewish settlements in Palestine and Israel, and also as you were kind of indicating at the end, also the tension between socialism and capitalism, as it were, over the course of the entire history of Zionism and as well as beyond. I am interested, could you say a bit more perhaps about how the historical memory of this earliest time period of modern Jewish settlements in Palestine, how that is being reworked in contemporary terms, especially as the language of settler colonialism, is being perceived, certainly in, it's a topic that we talk about in academic circles, but it's also something that people are kind of tossing around as kind of like a hot potato in the public sphere as well. So like, to what extent, are you seeing the question of historical memory of the 19th century is being utilized, kind of both in terms of those people who want to criticize the Zionist project, as well as those who want to reframe it in different ways?
Yeah, well, I think the key divide that we see in discourse around Israel-Palestine, but also frankly about the United States, the country in which we live, is it's not a divide over whether settlement was a key mechanism of establishing the nation, but rather a debate over whether that settlement is good and justified and praiseworthy, or rather that it kind of hides within it displacement and structures of discrimination that have been obscured and need to be revealed. So, most of my book much of my book allows these descendants of early settlers to speak in their own terms, and they're speaking in enormously laudatory terms, right? They're not by any means critiquing what was going on. And I think it's possible to read my book and to come away like feeling proud of these early settlers, if that's what one is inclined to feel about this story. And yet one can look at these same primary sources and kind of see within them, right, the mechanisms by which certain stories are foregrounded, certain stories are rendered invisible, whether in narrative or after 48, even on the ground itself. And I don't know that it resolves the question, but it certainly, I think when people say, well, it's not settler colonial, but of course it's settlement, right? It's really not a disagreement about the centrality of settlement. It's a disagreement about what kind of value valence should be given to that settlement.
Thank you. Did somebody else want to ask a question? I see, Aliyah, you had turned your video on. Did you want to ask something?
Yes, I did. Hi, thank you. Sorry, I was on the road, so I'm from my phone. Thank you for this really wonderful and interesting lecture. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that you're using scholarship by American and Canadian and Australian with settler coloniality, but I am interested if you've seen in your primary sources of members of Aliyah Rishona, if they themselves were in connection with, were inspired by, were, I don't know, drew connections themselves between, the practices they did and things that other settler societies did.
So this was a point that, I gave a little indication of just at the end of the talk when I pointed to, the one commemoration society saying, we need to do what these settler societies in America are doing to celebrate the fathers of settlement. They also sometimes would use language of like cowboys and Indians in some of this commemorative stuff. So I look in one of the later chapters at this year of the first one celebration that Israel held in 1962-63 that included like summer camps for kids and activities. And you can see some of the ways in which they thought it was fairly self-evident that, right, like they were the cowboys in these narratives and the Indians were the Palestinians who were irrationally trying to undermine their attempts to kind of bring productive agriculture and settlement. So those would be two like prominent examples where, it sort of went without saying that, of course, it was a reasonable comparison, even though, of course, they knew that it was by no means identical.
Yeah, Jonathan, go ahead.
Thank you, Liora, for a wonderful talk that really, I think, exposes the depths and the degrees of variation in this period in really clear ways for me. One of the things that I'm pondering is, sort of the pre-first Aliyah Jewish population in Palestine. How do they factor into this story? I mean, you've drawn a very nice differentiation between the first Aliyah and the second Aliyah in terms of how those populations interacted. But how would you map the old Yishuv into this landscape?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question because this is a really big interest of mine, and I'm actually hoping that my next project, like the project I'm just getting started on now, is going to delve really directly into this question because of this periodization of the history of Zionism. You have these folks, these private colonists, getting they're like step one within Zionist history, and then you have the urban religious communities, Sephardi and Ashkenazi alike, being regarded as kind of like the latest or last iteration of the pre-Zionist Jewish story in Palestine, when in reality, you had a whole variety of alliances between these different populations over for a variety of reasons. I mean, one of them is that in their early years, these colonists were quite reliant on connections and services within the Jewish cities, right? That's where they would go to get rabbinical opinions. That's where they would go to get supplies. There's multiple examples of first Aliyah colonists marrying people from the so-called old Yishuv or urban pre-Zionist religious communities. You also have, especially Sephardi urbanites who tended to know Arabic and have more connections to Palestinian Arab elites than did Ashkenazi Jews brokering land purchases. So I guess I mentioned that briefly in the talk. Some of them were also involved with some of the emerging banks, which were providing credit to farmers. So you have on all kinds of levels, sort of the elite level of connection, and then just the level of individuals, really kind of a network of engagements with. Then as we move towards, the mid 20th century, you see alliances of memory as well. And so the organization I'm hoping to write about was called the Union of the Sons of the Yishuv referring to the Jewish community of Palestine. And it included as members first Aliyah colonists, so the folks you've heard me talk about today, Ashkenazi urban Jews, religious Jews, and Sephardi and Eastern Jewish communities, all of whom, at least the theory was, should come together and kind of demand that their family stories be recognized against what they saw as a practice of the Zionist movement, kind of disregarding them, seeing them as backwards, right? And not giving them the kind of recognition or even services that they deserved. So, I'm actually really excited to do more work on this topic because I think it's a kind of a huge gap in the scholarship still.
We still have some time for more questions as well. So anybody else who wants to ask a question.
Hey, this is Amir. I have a quick question. How do you think these books can help resolve Arab-Israeli conflicts?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know if they can. Well, okay, I'll try to answer as seriously as I can, which is that, I think understanding the past is absolutely essential for getting to the understanding of the present, right? The present is built on layers of the past. So for example, you look at the events of May 2021 that involved kind of a concern with a piece of land in Jerusalem, but it was also connected to Gaza, but was also connected to cities within Israel that had both Jewish and Palestinian populations, right? And various claims get made about settlement or about structures of violence, right? I think it's really important to kind of tell a story about the stages that lead up to there. Now, there's a lot of pieces to that story, but I think settlement is certainly one of them, right? How do you get to a reality where there's the kind of demographic patterns that we have? Why does this particular piece of land outside Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah, become such a bone of contention? People can kind of speculate and make guesses and often get it wrong, but having some sense of the trajectory helps understand the different parties to the conflict. I also think, and I think there are people who will disagree with me, that like trying to turn down the temperature of some of these debates can be helpful. Like, I'm someone who thinks there's I think I really understand through my research the kind of worldview and mindset that a variety of different actors in this story are bringing to the conversation in the present. That doesn't mean that I think all of their claims are necessarily equal, but I think being able to step back and kind of understand how different people come to their worldview and their position is absolutely essential for any type of conversation or resolution. But I'm just as hopeless as everybody else. So maybe end with that.
If I can kind of follow up on that a little bit, I think Amir's question is a tough one, right? But I think that it kind of gets at the heart of a big challenge that we often have as scholars, which is what is the impact of the work that we are doing, right? So I was wondering maybe if Liora, you could take a moment to kind of reflect on historical memory, right? Which is to say, why is it that looking at the historical memory of this time period of the 19th century, right? How is it that has kind of a very specific kind of meaning and utility as we're trying to understand sort of not just issues of commemoration and monument building and museums and archives and all these different things, but broadly speaking, kind of what has happened over the course of the past century and also kind of what is continuing today?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I think the simple answer to that question is that relatively few people read works of historical scholarship. A lot more people have some narrative of what happened in the past that they received from their family or from their community. Maybe they went to some commemoration or event that told some aspect of that story. So history actually is a living thing for people, not via scholarship, but via collective memory and commemoration. And I think kind of not to take that seriously, to assume that what's happening in the archives to piece together, the real story of the past, should you know, like we should like evangelize for the real story. You know, I think that has a place, but also understanding the mechanisms by which communities develop these very firmly held ideas of what happened in the past and what the past means and what their connection is to that past is actually much more important for understanding, right, contemporary relations between communities, including power relationships and economic relationships. So I guess I've become an evangelist for caring about what people who don't necessarily know what they're talking about have to say about the past.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Or also maybe like it would be very helpful to have like this unbiased history told through fair media. Like sometimes the media is just like taking one side and not showing the other side. Just a thought. Like it would be like a lot of people I think are interested to know what the reality is, what like the real history is, not what the story of a group. It's his story told by a group of winners, right? Just unbiased.
Yeah, no, for sure, right? Like thinking about how different source material leads us to ask different questions, and asking different questions leads us to different answers about what the story might be. So I'm a big advocate, like when I teach history classes, which is, you know, what I do with a lot of my time, is, you know, talking about how there is not one unbiased history, but there's rather different histories we get by asking different kinds of questions and looking at different kinds of sources. And I absolutely agree with you that certain types of questions and sources are just either not being asked, or the fact that they're being asked is not as well known to broader publics, and that there's an interest in sharing that more widely.
Thank you.
Yeah, so you know, thank you all of you for these really great questions. You know, I wish we had more time to dive into this. You know, we are sort of running into the end of our program today. Again, I just want to thank Liora for joining us, you know, all the way from the Pacific Northwest, you know, and for sharing this really remarkable, interesting research. I feel like we have so much more to talk about. We'll have to continue some of these issues as we go forward. You know, it's really phenomenal that the book is out and that you're able to share all of this with us. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And I'm happy to stick around. You know, we pretend that this is after the talk and you can come up to me if you want to. So I'm just going to I'll stay here until, you know, folks need to leave.